to the people of Baltimore. I heard your call to no justice, no peace.
It's a lot of brothers and women, too, that's incarcerated for things they had nothing to do with.
BPD engages in a pattern or practice of making unconstitutional stops, searches, and arrests.
Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Afro First Edition. I'm your host, Sean Yoes, Baltimore editor of the Afro-American newspaper, the #1 black newspaper in America. My first guest for this inaugural episode is Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby. Mosby officially took the essays chair in January 2015. 4 months later, Baltimore was thrust into the international spotlight in April when 25-year-old Freddie Gray was killed while in custody of the Baltimore City Police Department following an arrest. The subsequent uprising after Gray's funeral produced some of the most harrowing hours in Baltimore's history. The next month, Mosby was elevated as a symbol of the law enforcement reform movement in America when she made the decision to indict the 6 officers connected to Gray's death. In some ways, it was an unprecedented move by a U.S. prosecutor in the midst of a rising tide of police brutality allegations and deaths of mostly poor, mostly black males in the hands of law enforcement. And in the process, Mosby has become an arch target of the Fraternal Order of Police and their supporters. Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Sean.
I want to go back to April of 2015, the day when Freddie Gray was arrested. I think the video of him being hauled into the back of that van went viral. What were your thoughts when you initially saw that video of him and him screaming, hollering in agony? You hear the people on the residents nearby screaming their disapproval of what was happening. What ran through your mind?
So what I can say is I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I really wanted to get to the bottom of what took place around the incident, and I can tell you that we immediately started to do an investigation. We contacted the police, and we were spending about 12 and 14-hour days trying to get to the bottom of what took place. I knew that there had been something that had to have happened before that incident, and thankful, we were grateful for some of the admissions that the officers made. And at the end of the day, on May 1st, 2015, when I came out and I announced the charges against those 6 officers, we had more evidence in that case than we do a lot of other cases. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't do anything differently.
He's arrested on the 12th. He's 3 days later, I believe. By April 15th, he's dead. Mm-hmm. His funeral was the 27th. The 27th. And then obviously the uprising began, the epicenter of it being Mondawmin Mall and Penn North. As that was transpiring, as all of that was happening, the investigation was already underway. Mm-hmm. What was running through your mind? What was going through your spirit?
So, when you talk about my spirit, again, as a prosecutor, I was looking at trying to get to the bottom of what took place. You had, in the end, an innocent 25-year-old man, black man by the name of Freddie Carlos Gray Jr., who was, in my opinion, unreasonably taken into police custody, made eye contact with the police, and was put into a wagon head first, feet shackled and handcuffed. And then his pleas for medical attention were ignored. And so, I based my decisions on the facts and the law. And again, I wouldn't do anything differently. But as the uprising was taking place, I can tell you that was about 2 blocks away from my home. I live in the heart of West Baltimore. I always tell everyone, I'm raising 2 little girls. I don't have to open up the newspaper or look at the news to see what the violence plaguing our communities. All I have to do is open up my door. And I was concerned. I was definitely concerned about the uprising. But at the end of the day, I also wanted to get to the bottom of what took place for Freddie Gray.
Indeed. As you go forward, and it's interesting, you say you basically a 3-minute drive from Penn North. Mm-hmm. I live around the corner from you, so mm-hmm. I know exactly what you're talking about. I was born and raised 3 minutes from Mondawmin, so juxtaposition of that intersectionality, if you will, of how everything played out is fascinating. being someone who's born and raised in West Baltimore. But as you proceeded, as you went forward, and on that day, I think it was May 1st.
It was May 1st.
When you made the announcements outside of
War Memorial.
Right. You hear as you say the words, we're going to charge these officers, I'm paraphrasing, you hear the uproar of approval. It was almost like a release, a cathartic release from people who had experienced decades, generations of police brutality with no consequences.
The findings of our comprehensive, thorough, and independent investigation, coupled with the medical examiner's determination that Mr. Gray's death was a homicide, which we received today, has led us to believe that we have probable cause to file criminal charges.
Police had been able to operate with impunity. As you were going through that, as you were making that public statement about the charges, what were you? I mean, I understand that at the base, at the essence of it is you're seeking justice for Freddie Gray, but there was a lot of emotion on that day.
So I think there was a whole lot of emotion even leading up to May 1st, and when we look at the uprising, I hate to even refer to it as riots because I don't believe that. I think these were uprising, and when you look at some of the systemic sort of issues that plague our city, and specifically our community, you know, we had some unproductive sort of responses to it, but you could also understand why. You know, when we look at our city, which is in one of the richest states in the country, Baltimore's population, 24% of Baltimore's population lives in poverty. 35% of children live below poverty. We have 18,000 vacant houses, 16,000 vacant lots, the number of liquor stores that inundate our communities. And when we look at even the unemployment rate for young African American men between the ages of 18 and 24, which is more than twice that of whites, like those are some of the on top of the discriminatory policing practices against African American men and the violence that plagues our communities. I understood the emotions that were attached to the uprising. So on May 1st, you know, I did my job. And that's essentially why I wanted to become a prosecutor, is to be able to apply justice fairly and equally to everybody, regardless of one's sex, religion, or occupation. And for the first time, I think, and I would say not the first time, but in a long while, you know, you had accountability across the board. And that accountability ultimately led to exposure. A week after I announced those charges, the Department of Justice came in and exposed the discriminatory policing practices of one of the largest police agencies in the country. That exposure ultimately led to reform. You know, we now have a federally enforceable consent decree that even despite the Trump administration that tried to forestall it, we as a community said absolutely not. So, you know, I look back at that time and I wouldn't do anything differently.
And we're going to get to the Trump administration and the DOJ consent decree in a moment, but I want to go back to the first trial of Officer Porter. You came very close to a prosecution, conviction rather, and it was you. I mean, you just alluded to the broader context in which the uprising occurred. There's even a broader context in which you prosecuted, rather you indicted these police officers, and that broader context is a FOP that is really one of the most powerful unions in the United States, and one that has really been able to operate almost with impunity in our state specifically, enjoying the first law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights in the nation, one of the most broad law enforcement officers. I mean, so what you were doing in indicting these officers, the broader context was really attacking the system in a way that it had not been attacked before. When I say that, I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, you were going against the status quo. And despite all of that, you still came extremely close to convicting Porter. But Billy Murphy, the venerable defense attorney, who is the attorney for the Gray family, he has said recently, and you may not be able to comment on this, I don't know, that he felt like, from his position, that sabotage was at work as far as your investigation was concerned. I mean, what can you say to that as far as the process is concerned, speaking to the power structure that was in place that you had to deal with?
So I think that when we look at what happened, and you're absolutely right, when we had the first case, it was tried in front of a jury among one's peers, and it was a hung jury. So we had the ability of trying Officer Porter again. But I think I've been extremely vocal. I had learned so many different lessons through the Freddie Gray case, one of which I've actually proposed several police accountability reforms. And first and foremost, I just don't believe that any sort of profession should have the task of investigating itself. I think that there's going to be inherent sort of biases when it comes to questioning and interrogation, and I've been already very vocal about some of the sabotage that did take place in that investigation. There were search warrants that weren't executed, but again, I think when we look at it, I don't think it's just a police issue. I think that this is a professional sort of issue. And this is one that we should take up. And when we look all across the country at other sort of municipalities, right? Like we go to San Francisco, we go to New York, and these are major metropolitan areas. They have their own sort of investigators that will investigate police misconduct. I don't have that. In the city of independent investigators outside of the police department. Right. I didn't have that in the state's attorney's office. I have investigators that were former police officers, but they have no investigative authority. So they don't have the power of arrest. They don't have the power to execute search and seizure warrants. And it was incredibly frustrating because the investigation, we needed that. But again, those are some of the reasons why we have to stay and pay attention. I went down to legislative and legislation last year, and one of the things that I was pushing was the police powers for my investigators. And you do have precedents for it in other major municipalities and even in the state of Maryland. You have Talbot County, Garrett County, Dorchester County, where the state's attorney investigators have police powers. Unfortunately, I was told that that's not going to happen in the city of Baltimore.
That it was not going to happen.
That is not going to happen. Chairman basically said on the record, it's never going to happen.
Chairman, which chairman?
Chairman Zirkin.
I thought, okay. But you alluded to the fact that the first trial was a jury trial and you almost got the conviction. That the rest of the trials were the bench trials. Judge Barry Williams, and for lack of a better term, I think many of your supporters would suggest that the fix was in, if you will, after that transition was made. But it seemed clear that was the way all the officers were going to go after the first bench verdict came down. After everything,
and I wouldn't say the fix was in. I mean, I just want to be clear. Like, I guarantee as a prosecutor the process, right? I don't guarantee convictions in any case, and I think that was done. What was clear was that the judge did not believe the state's theory of the case, and not only did he acquit, the driver of the vehicle, he acquitted one of the arresting officers, he acquitted the highest ranking police officer. So it became abundantly clear that, he didn't believe our theory of the case. And that's the process. The judge was well within his right to make that decision.
Understood. It was not long after you announced the indictment, and then obviously through the process of the trials, the attacks came.
Oh, yeah.
With incredible zeal. You had somehow thrown the officers under the bus. It was politically motivated. You were in over your head somehow. The officers actually sued you, I guess, for defamation of character.
Still pending.
Which is still pending.
Mm-hmm.
But many of those attacks became extremely personal, and many of those attacks were racial and racist. Mm-hmm. Speak to what was going through your mind, or what is still going through your mind as you grapple with this, because the onslaught, if you will, the attacks have not really let up, I don't think.
So what I can say is that this was definitely something that I did not anticipate. 4 months into my term, it was kind of a precursor for what we see on a regular basis right now on Twitter, right? Like we see the negativity, but this happened almost immediately after I charged the officers. I had a group, an organization called Red Nation Rising, where it was just on Twitter, I was being blasted. I was getting these death threats and hate mail to my office. I can remember one incident where they described vividly how my husband would be killed coming outside of our house in an obituary, and how when we called for the police, no one would show up. There were, I would get these racist and I can laugh in retrospect, but when you're going through it, you're like, what is this? And this was before the divisive sort of times in which we're currently in. So it was definitely something that I did not anticipate. I can remember one note was, "You racist nigger bitch."
Wow.
I'm not supposed to say that.
It's okay.
And I said the irony of that, but that's something where, we can kind of laugh at now because we're accustomed to it. But when I was going through it, what I had to learn how to do, and rather quickly, was not to internalize it. And to understand that it wasn't about me individually, about Marilyn Mosby, but what Marilyn Mosby represents. And you kind of hit the nail on the head when you talked about, challenging the status quo. As a prosecutor, we got to think about this role, right? It is the most important role in the criminal justice system. And for far too long, we have not understood that. Prosecutors are the ones who decide who's going to be charged, what they're going to be charged with, what sentence recommendations they're going to make. They make the decision as to whether or not a person is even going to get into the criminal justice system in the first place. And when we look at the disproportionate impact that the criminal justice system has had on communities of color, you cannot ignore the fact that 95% of the prosecutors in this country are white, 79% are white men, and as a woman of color, I represent 1% of all elected women of color prosecutors in the country. Wow. And so what I had to learn how to do very quickly was not to internalize it and to say, the backlash that I'm receiving is not about me individually, but what my position represents.
You mentioned just a moment ago the irony of how that you were characterized by some of these people. But the other great irony is the fact that you come from a family of law enforcement.
Oh, yeah.
Speak to that a little
So what I can say, I know I've been accused of being anti-police, and that is so far from the truth. I'm anti-police brutality, and I've been very clear about that. I come from 5 generations of police officers. My great-uncle, my great-uncle, my grandfather was one of the founding members of the first Black police organization in Massachusetts. They referred to our house in the inner city of Boston as the police house. And I told you the story about a month and a half ago, where I was in a coffee shop and somebody came in and was like, "Are you Marilyn? And are you the state attorney?" I said, "Yeah, I am." He was like, "Well, I just want to thank you." And I said, "Thank me for what?" And he said, "Mr. T saved my life." Mr. T was my grandfather. And he was like, "I was one of those knucklehead guys from around the corner that used to be at your house all the time." So we would always constantly have people in my house who were claiming that they were related. And I'd be like, "Hey, cuz." I'm like, "I don't know you." But you don't appreciate, like, in that moment, that your grandfather, who is the epitome of community policing, right? Like he was not only a paternalistic sort of figure for me and my family, but for that community. And that's the one thing that we lack.